Hello, my name is Jonathan Ng, and I'm here with my colleague Zach Kahn from the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. Today is October 29th, 2023, and we are at the Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island in New York City. Right now we have the privilege to speak with Dr. Jessica Wang about the life and the legacy of Professor Walter LaFeber. Thank you, Dr. Wang, for agreeing to participate in this interview. To kick things off, I was wondering if you could talk about your first encounters with Walter LaFeber, whether his reputation or coming to meet him in person for the first time.
I mean, I guess reputationally, I had some sense that he was an important historian because my sister, who was 3 years ahead of me in college, she went to Harvard and she knew who Walter LaFeber was. So when I decided to go to Cornell, I somehow knew that that was the one faculty member at Cornell she had ever heard of. So I knew vaguely that he was important. I was more interested in what is nominally called domestic politics, domestic U.S. political history, than foreign policy. So I actually took Richard Polenberg's courses first. To my regret, I never did take Walt's big lecture course. But in my junior year, so this would have been spring of 1987, I got into his seminar on the Cold War. So that was I don't recall my first actual meeting with him, but I was in his course. That's when I met him.
And what was your first impression? How was he teaching that seminar? Are there particular memories of that class that stick out to you?
Yeah, I'll say I don't remember the seminar that well because I was kind of shy then. I had been a science major through most of my years at Cornell, so in some ways, I knew I was good at doing research projects, and Richard Polenberg recognized that and supported that. But I think I was still finding my way as a historian. I probably didn't really find my way until I was an assistant professor. And so I didn't say much in that seminar. And I found the reading challenging. I'm not sure I was terribly good at it. I guess, the part where I interacted with Walt most was probably on the research paper, because I decided I wanted to do something on scientists and nuclear age politics. It was the tail end of the Cold War, but growing up under the nuclear threat was very much a part of my childhood. And as a science major, wanting to know more about the history of this momentous scientific and technological development that was at that time like the major existential threat for the United States and the world, that was very much on my mind. So I was interested in nuclear age history. And so I did a paper on the hydrogen bomb decision. And Walt, directed me to sources that he knew off the top of his head. I think Herbert York's book on the advisors was one of the things he immediately pulled off his shelf. He probably steered me in the direction of Alice Kimball Smith's book on the scientist movement. Just the other major sources that were there, the major literature at the time. That was kind of an important early experience in that course.
And were there particular snippets of advice or ways that he did classroom management that stuck out to you?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's very much discussion-based. What sticks out for me from that course is, first of all, in terms of doing the research paper, his emphasis on contextualization was very important. Like, he insisted, you didn't just have your narrow research problem, but you could put it within a larger historical context. So knowing more broadly about the context of the Cold War was something you had to do and understand. He would always be asking, what's the argument, right? Of course, he's not the only history professor who asks this question, but when you're an undergraduate, that's always the difficult one to answer, right? What's the argument? I don't know, I'm just interested. And I don't think I had a terribly good argument, but I did what I could in that paper. I think what I also recall from that course that was really important is his emphasis on not reifying the divide between domestic and foreign policy, that, foreign policy to a great extent was about domestic concerns. It was domestic policy by other means. I don't think he used that word, but that's kind of the basic insight. And that's something I've taken away with me ever since, is that central intervention of just not artificially dividing these, believing in the artificial divide that these two categories create. I think the other thing I really took away from that course was his skepticism about invoking public opinion as explanation. Like, he wouldn't let you say, well, public opinion is the reason why the United States government made this decision. He thought that kind of thing, he didn't see that there were good ways to prove those kinds of arguments. He emphasized that, public opinion was something that could be molded from the top down. It wasn't just providing pressure from the bottom up. And so he wouldn't let us get away with invoking public opinion as explanation ever. So I don't let my own students do it either.
That's great. You've talked about certain ways that he unsettled arguments that students had, how he was sort of a Socratic presence in a way, maybe forcing people to think a little bit more critically or consciously about what they believed. Obviously, the theme of this conference is thinking otherwise, and looking at how LaFeber helped people become more aware of their critical faculties and sharpen them. Are there other ways that you recall him helping you learn how to think otherwise?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think this, this warning not to indulge in the distinction between domestic and foreign policy, it's been a lesson that I think can be applied more broadly. And it's probably, and he's probably not alone in this, in that, I went to graduate school in the era of social construction of scientific knowledge. So there were these kinds of messages too. But it was an important early lesson on not taking categories for granted and thinking through very carefully what they mean, what the claims are behind certain categories, how they're being constructed, what are the circumstances that are making them seem normal. I think that seminar may have been the root of being able to kind of deal with those kinds of issues. Like in my own work right now, what does it mean to be international? And for the early 20th century, which is the period I work on now, in an era of high imperialism, does it make more sense to talk about certain relationships as inter-imperial rather than as sort of generically international? And so, what are the kinds of work these categories are doing, and what are the things they obscure as well? And so I think Walt's teaching was a part of that. I think being really meticulous about sources, about your own writing as well, is also something that Walt really impressed upon me. Because I did my senior thesis with him. So that was my big experience with Walt. And, and again, he insisted that you think carefully. He would push you on the argument. I was his research assistant my senior year. And so we did page proofs. I read page proofs of his book, The American Age, with him, which he did the old-fashioned way, in which somebody reads from the original manuscript while the other person follows the actual proofs. And, and I didn't realize when I started the job, he would be asking, my advice or expecting me to see typos or, if there were misplaced commas and that kind of thing. I was helping him to find those, right? And, sometimes he'd use the same word 3 times in, a single paragraph or over a couple of paragraphs, and he would ask for synonyms. Like my one triumph that I remember is there's a passage. He had described things as out of control, spinning out of control, that kind of thing, 3 times within a short space. And he knew I was a science major, so he said, what's the word for when a graph goes like this? And I thought for a moment, and I said, haywire? And he laughed and said, so that's a scientific term, huh? But he used it.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, but it's that kind of that care you have to take as a scholar. That was something I learned from him. Yeah.
Was the senior thesis that you did also the project on nuclear scientists?
Yeah. So senior year I went to him. I said, I want to do a project on something to do about scientists and nuclear age politics. He said, that's great. I don't know anything about it. This way I'll learn something too, which is also really wonderful. Because, he was open-minded and curious about a lot of things. He didn't just say, I don't do that. You should go work with someone else. Which, in grad school, I encountered people who were like that. And it astounded me because at Cornell, I had nothing but this kind of support, thanks to people like Walt. So that openness to working with someone who was doing a topic he wasn't entirely familiar with, that was also really, really important to me. It's like one of those lessons I've tried to, as much as I can, be like that as a professor. So I had this topic, and of course, he also knew more than he gave himself credit. He was pulling the books off the shelf, and I remember Peter Kuznick's book, Beyond the Laboratory, I think came out that fall. He happened upon a book review, so he handed me a copy of the book review and said, go get this, So he was also on the lookout for you. He was really on the lookout for students, actually, because the other thing, before I get to answer to your question, the other thing he did for my senior thesis is when I got the topic nailed down, maybe I should tell you the story of how the topic came about. So I had this vague idea. He said, okay, start doing some reading. And he suggested maybe I think about working on the physicist Robert Wilson, who was at Cornell, very eminent, had been on the Manhattan Project, involved in anti-nuclear or arms control activism after the end of World War II. And he was the big particle accelerator physicist at Cornell. And Walt said, why don't you think about working on Robert Wilson? And if you really ingratiate yourself to him, maybe he'll let you look at his papers. And, I started doing a little research on Wilson, but I'm like, I don't want to have to get to know this really famous physicist and charm him into letting me use his papers. So I was also like reading the secondary literature and looking for something else I could work on, someone safely no longer with us. And I happened upon a throwaway line towards the end of Alice Kimball Smith's A Peril and a Hope about the physicist Edward Condon and how later he would run into difficulties with the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And I saw that and I said, that sounds interesting, I'll look into this. Probably someone's written about it, but hey, who knows? I started looking into it. Turned out, nobody had written about this security clearance and loyalty case. And it was, in the history of American science, this is second only to the Oppenheimer case. But in the literature at that time on anti-communism and American science, there was stuff that had been written about Oppenheimer. There was virtually nothing else, including nothing very significant written about Edward Condon. So his battle with the House Committee on Un-American Activities, that became my senior thesis project. And, so I was digging, I found lots of published sources. New York Times covered this case very closely. There were hearings by HUAC and other committees. There was stuff, you could find in primary sources that were published. But Walt went further than that. He wrote to Barton Bernstein because he didn't do research in this area, but Bart did. So he wrote to Bart and I guess must have just said, I have a student working on this topic. What archives should she look at? And Bart wrote a letter back. I still have it somewhere, I'm pretty sure, and I can almost see the typeface on that beat-up typewriter Bart was always using. Bart wrote back a nice letter, and at the end of it were all sorts of recommendations for me to look at the papers of the scientist movement at University of Chicago, the Oppenheimer papers at the Library of Congress. He might have mentioned one or two other collections. He said he didn't know where Condon's papers were, but I wrote to U Chicago. They got me some files. They copied on microfilm. I sent a friend during winter break to the Library of Congress, a friend who lived in DC. I gave her 2 rolls of dimes because that's what you used at the copying machine in those days. I said, there are these 2 folders at the manuscripts division of the Library of Congress. Here's how it works when you go in. Because with Richard Polenberg, I had done a project the previous summer on the Japanese internment cases in the Supreme Court. So I'd been to the Library of Congress and done research there before. So I told this friend, this is what you do in an archive, this is how you register, blah, blah, blah. Get me these 2 files and copy them. And so, yeah, I had a very good research base for my senior thesis, thanks to Walt.
Well, LaFeber must have been thrilled to have a student who was so engrossed in this research, and also it seems like it was a genuine sort of detective case where you have that throwaway line in the book, then it leads you to look for Condon's papers. I mean, it seems like the most exciting way the research process can happen. Yeah, I imagine he was pretty pleased. Certainly, when I have students who develop a really great topic, I'm thrilled. So I hope he was. I can't speak for him in that respect. But I do remember, he read one of my drafts and I think it had some quotes from Condon, like firing back at the FBI about certain things about FBI surveillance, and I just remember him saying something like, "This guy Condon didn't think anything lying down." I mean, it was an interesting set of events that, I think it was exciting to learn about. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it was quite a wonderful experience to do this with him, and I lucked out in coming up with this topic too, which helped as well. And it became my doctoral dissertation. It became my first book. So this was the start of my professional career.
And then maybe transitioning to your graduate studies, where you talked about how you took this particular project, you turned it into your first book. Are there other memories of maybe advice or mentorship from LaFeber that you took with you, those lessons into your graduate studies?
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of the lesson, I've already talked about sort of some of those main lessons of interpretation that, they were important to me then and they're important to me to this day, right? Like not separating foreign from domestic policy. That's like, a foundational lesson that that's stayed with me ever since. The need to think carefully, not to indulge knee-jerk ideology. Yes, one thing he would, if in writing the senior thesis, if I wrote anything that sort of teetered too far in the direction of editorializing or opinionizing, he would say, "What do you think you are, a journalist?" And I didn't have the heart to say, well, I actually quite admire a lot of journalistic historical writing, but he wouldn't let you get away with that. And so, and I think it's not that you couldn't make a strong argument, but you had to be able to support it, right? If, unsupported opinion of any kind was not welcome. I suspect, especially, as an undergraduate, you certainly haven't earned the right, in a sense. And so he was quite strict in that sense of making you kind of adhere to reason and insisting that you be able to back up anything that you said. And I think, that was an important early lesson to learn as well.
Yeah, one thing that you said that's striking to me is his emphasis on everything needed to be backed up by factual evidence. There needed to be a very rigorous method to whatever argument one was making. In the volume, there's a reference to many students who had wonderful experiences with LaFeber. There's also one reference to Ann Coulter, the conservative commentator, who wrote a sort of a hatchet job on LaFeber at one time. I was wondering, particularly because by the time you were working with LaFeber, he had such an eminent reputation. Was there ever pushback against his teaching on campus by students who maybe, for one reason or another, didn't align with his what he was teaching, or maybe who were politically sort of skeptical of what he was doing?
Yeah, not that I know of, but I was in a much smaller circle though. But nothing that I ever heard. And he certainly had such a strong reputation for his fair-mindedness, his willingness to listen to the other side, right? And his openness to being questioned too. So, and he was not somebody who said careless things either. So, and this is where, at the same time, I had some inkling of him as being part of this school of thought that was, at least at one time, considered controversial. And I think, by the time I was an undergraduate in the 1980s, there was still enough of that kind of reputation surrounding the Wisconsin school. But certainly, at the time he wrote New Empire, and that was a few years after Williams wrote Tragedy of American Diplomacy. And at a time in the Cold War where there were a lot of careless accusations about people and their supposed leftism, right? I mean, there's that old article by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., is it from '67? This old review article, which has, I tell my students, this is like the meanest footnote I've ever seen, in which he basically says, I don't call Williams a communist, I just note certain similarities between what he writes and the dominant line of the Communist Party. I mean, that's a paraphrase, but it's more or less what this footnote says. And, if you read Tragedy, Williams was quite conservative, actually, in that, who are his heroes in the book? His heroes, it's not like, Lenin or anything like that. His heroes are the so-called honorable conservatives, people in the Senate who were willing to imagine putting the brakes on empire. I guess, it's people like it's William J. Fulbright at the end of the book, at least maybe one of the later editions. So these are not the writings of a flaming radical. He was a conservative in some ways who said radical things. Or, somebody the other night, I think this is accurate, was talking about Williams as a kind of prairie populist in that sense. Or, part of that Midwest progressive tradition. And I think Walt was a part of that too, He questioned centralized power because, he was from a conservative part of the country that had qualms about centralized power. I think the accusations of the supposed communist sympathies of the Wisconsin school, at least, of Williams and Tragedy, and then certainly Walt, were vastly overstated. But these kinds of accusations, they had power in the 60s, right? And so they were let loose easily and irresponsibly. When I think about sort of controversies surrounding Walt's ideas, I don't think about the classroom in Cornell. I think about the historical profession and the kind of fight that was going on in diplomatic history in the 60s, still in the 60s and 70s.
Thinking about his classroom management, the experiences you had with him as an advisee, are there things that you observed him do or that he taught you, which you carry on in your own teaching and your own sort of post undergraduate academic career?
Yeah, I think he was really considerate. He was sort of, he was old school. There was a little formal kind of divide between, him as the professor and you as the student, but he was also very considerate and looked out for his students. And it's a little thing, but I remember when I was working on the senior thesis, I needed to call the U Chicago archives. At that time, long distance phone calls, they weren't super expensive, but they cost money. So he invited me to use his office phone at the end of office hours, right? That's a small thing, but it really matters. Or, when my costs for getting documents were, it was a little over $100 or something. Again, it's not an enormous amount of money, but I was paying it out of pocket. And he said, well, go right to this particular dean, and there's funding from the undergraduate research fund. I didn't know that existed, but he put me in touch, and Cornell paid for my documents. So these are small things, but he took the time to be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that consistently has encouraged and surprised me. Is here's somebody who's incredibly busy, balancing all these different projects and hats, and yet he's still so attentive to the needs of his students.
Yeah, he always had time somehow. I don't know how, because you're absolutely right. I think about his prominence at Cornell and how much he must have had to do, and I think about my own inability to manage my time at the university. Maybe to be fair to me, though, he also had Sandy, and I don't have the equivalent of Sandy to help me out. So, there's a partnership there that was also part of academe in that generation of, professors who had supportive spouses who helped to, support their careers. He didn't have to make dinner or do the laundry or anything like that. So he did have that advantage on me, for example. But at the same time, it's not just that. He also he had a lot of energy. So as I said, I was his RA. I once got home and there was a phone message waiting for me that said, call me anytime before 2 a.m. It was about midnight when I got home, and I was like, I thought surely professors lived in more normal hours than that. But that was, that was the message waiting for me. So I called him around midnight or so. Got whatever message I needed to get.
That is funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I have the impression that he needed to sleep very little.
Yeah.
Sort of envious of the energy that he had.
Yeah. I don't know how late he slept, but he sure didn't go to bed early.
One of the things I would like to talk about is your contribution in the forthcoming volume. One thing that fascinated me in your chapter is how you talk about the evolution of his intellectual trajectory. He started out focusing with obviously a more traditional diplomatic history lens, and then by the time he was studying global capitalism in the 1990s, he was looking at soft power, the power of culture in particular. Could you talk about your work on this chapter in particular, and how you make sense of LaFeber's intellectual evolution as a scholar?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a part of his openness to new experience and new ideas, and wanting to learn more and kind of being willing to reach outward and to be curious about topics that he was not as highly conversant in. And so, I think the Michael Jordan book is a really good example of that kind of an intellect, right? But it's there from the beginning. I was thinking yesterday, the dissertation, which I've never looked at, but I guess it's about the foreign policy of the second Cleveland administration, which if that had been his first book, it's hard to see how he would have been become the scholar that he's known as. And so I didn't get a chance to ask yesterday, but there was something more going on there, and going from this quite narrow dissertation to this masterful synthesis and new way of thinking about foreign policy in the late 19th century. And so, there was a kind of ambition and breadth in the new empire that, I'd love to know more about the background to how he went from the dissertation to that first book, because it's pretty extraordinary. So yeah, I think and as I said earlier, like the fact that I came to him with this vague idea for a thesis topic, and his first reaction was he didn't know anything, and that was wonderful. I think that's part of the spirit that also meant that he was willing to think about, soft power and consumerism and basketball and global capitalism.
Did he ever talk about sports with you? Because
not so much. I knew he was a sports fan somehow. We talked music a little bit more, although I don't recall particularly long conversations, but I was pretty serious about piano when I was an undergraduate, and he knew that, and so, music would show up in our conversations. Like, he was interested in classical music. I think it was my spring of junior year, I was doing a duet recital with a friend, and to my surprise, he and Dick Polenberg and a historian who was visiting to give a lecture at Cornell, they came for the second half.
Oh, that's
right?
sweet.
Yeah, and they came backstage afterwards. I was so touched by this, right? I had no expectation at all that they would come. I felt badly because I hadn't been at the talk by this visiting scholar either, but nonetheless, yeah, they came.
That's a really beautiful story.
Yeah.
And it resonates with what Anne Foster told us, which is that when she talked to him as a graduate student, oftentimes they wouldn't talk about history. They'd talk about opera or fiction or just other things that were swirling about in broader society, not just purely disciplinary concerns.
Yeah, I mean, he was interested in a lot of things, and he was interested in the people around him and students and what they did, right? And so, it's also, like showing up at this recital is part of the difference between being at an institution that's in a small college town and being at a university that's, in a large city too, because it does mean there's a life on campus, that there is an environment that is more conducive to close relations between faculty and students. Whereas, in an urban area, like I'm at a public university, there are a lot of commuting students, people are coming from far away, people don't necessarily live in the same community, so it's a different environment too. But even so, it was really nice of him and Dick to come.
Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful memory.
Yeah.
Sort of thinking about his broader legacy, what do you think is LaFeber's main contribution to the historical discipline? Maybe you could talk about how you see it, his work continue to influence your own research, and maybe what do you think LaFeber himself would have seen as his main contribution or his main area of concern?
Yeah, I don't know if I want to speak to that second question. I think it's a little presumptuous of me to. I don't think I would have a good answer. For me, though, he is part of a remarkable group of scholars and moment in the mid to late 20th century who thought about American empire and who did so at a time when it was controversial to do it, right? Like even when I was in grad school, you would still read historiographical essays that were about, was there an American empire? If so, was it an informal empire? Was it, like the accidental empire thesis? Like somehow it was just by accident that the U.S. built itself as the world's, great superpower with all of its imperial overtones. Like these were serious historical debates that if you read Walt's work, if you read Williams too, you knew this made no sense whatsoever. Like, can't we get away from this and just start with empire as our starting point? Like, okay, yeah, certain aspects of the US were an informal empire, but you could say the same thing about the British Empire. So, and a lot of this had to do with the fact that, historians also didn't read a lot of US historians didn't read comparatively or globally very often in this time period. But, like, as you know from your own acquaintance with Daniel Immerwahr, we don't have these debates anymore, thank God, all right? We start with American empire as a framework and move on from there and take it in various directions. And, it's thanks to scholars like Walt that we finally reached this point.
Are there any other reflections or memories that you'd like to put into the record?
I'm trying to think if there's anything in particular I've left out. It'll come to me the moment I leave this room. I guess I do want to say, this isn't about Walt, but I do want to say my first grade advisor at Cornell was Richard Pohlenberg, and I think this discussion would be incomplete if I didn't mention Dick's influence as well, because, I took his big post-1945 U.S. lecture course as a freshman. As a sophomore, I managed to get into his freshman seminar. I skipped the second semester of freshman seminar because I couldn't get into one that I wanted to take. But Dick's seminar, you had to sign up ahead of time and I think interview with him before he would let you in. So I had a better chance than like going through the random process of getting your sign-up time. And mine was always like in the last cohort, which meant there were very few choices. So I had a seminar with Dick Pohlenberg on the First Amendment, I think, in American legal history, or civil liberties is what the topic was in American legal history. And, he was the person who he thought I could write. He encouraged me to do a big research project at the end of the course instead of the short essays every other week. When that semester I also applied for the NEH, had these Younger Scholars Awards that would give you a summer grant to do a project. And I applied for one and got one, and that's when I did this first archival research experience doing a project on the Supreme Court and the Japanese internment cases. So, Dick was really important, but he thought I shouldn't just do everything with him, that I should get to know some other Cornell faculty. So he sent me to Walt to do my senior thesis, or he at least made it clear I wasn't going to do my senior thesis with him. I think my memory at least is that he sent me to Walt. I don't quite know, but he was really important as well.
Well, I think that's a lovely note to close on, and again, a testament to the importance of this rich relational web that LaFeber was a part of.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wang.